Hello, today's story is about Regetta Maria Neilson Thurston, who was my great-grandmother on my father's mother's side. Her story is very interesting and holds all the fun, drama, and tragedy of a true love story. Some clues in the record says that she goes by Maria Thurston in her later life, but her first name is Regetta, so I'm going to refer to her as Regetta throughout this story. And most of what I'll be sharing with you is actually her record from her autobiography. And so I'll be quoting much of it and reading her record because she told the story so well and so passionately as a young woman in love who went through tragedy and then ended up, well, let's find out how she ends up. So she says, I'm the oldest of 5 children, born to Frederick and Katharina Neilson on February 18th of 1845 in Aalborg, Denmark. Then when Regetta was 5 years old in 1850, her father Frederick read Apostle Erastus Snow's writing and wrote to invite the elders to come and teach him. They actually came and stayed with the family for several months and taught the whole family. And Frederick was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And 6 months later, Regetta's mother, Katharina, was also baptized into the church. She records an incident that happened shortly after this by saying, an incident that happened shortly after my mother joined the church, I well remember. Word came to us that grandmother was sick and wanted father and mother to come over as they had only lived a short distance from our home. My mother had a weakness. She was subject to fits, known as convulsions today. She came home from grandmother's early, and when father came home, she was in a fit. Father sent for the elders to come and administer to her, which they did. She was instantly healed and never had another fit as long as she lived. One of the elders who administered to her was Elder Christian Larson and used to live in Weber, Utah. This was one of my first testimonies to the healing power of God. End of quote. Now, I want to jump forward to Regetta's memories when she was 13 years old and just give a snippet of that. Her parents were no longer attending church. However, her mother was a good friend of the branch president's wife. And she continues her story like this. My mother was a great friend of the wife of the branch president, Frederick Klingbeck. So when I was 13 years old, she sent me to care for Sister Klingbeck's baby. While I was there, I heard a missionary by the name of Niels Wilhelmsen explain the first principles of the gospel. I was interested and began to study and was converted. I requested baptism. I had been sick in bed 5 days and got right up and went and got baptized and confirmed by Elder Lars Larson on March the 6th of 1859 in a canal about 1.5 miles from our home at 10 o'clock at night. They had to chop the ice to perform that sacred ordinance, and I had to walk home in my wet clothes. I was not sick 1 minute, which was a testimony to me. The next day, my brother found out that I'd been baptized. He spit on me and made all manner of fun of me and would not eat at the same table with me and called me names. But I did not care. I was not sorry for what I had done. Now, I'm going to jump ahead to the love story. You may want to read the stories in between her starting work, helping others at 13 years old, and 18 years old now, and working to keep house and cook for the mission president and missionaries in Denmark. So here's her own story in her own words. I went to work keeping house for President Soren Jensen and the missionaries, and I was kept busy. While working for the president before leaving Denmark, I got acquainted with my future husband, James Thurston, I was not very favorably impressed with him the first time I saw him. I told the president's wife he was the ugliest, most ill-mannered fellow I had ever seen. But afterward, I fell in love with him and was promised to him before leaving our native land, Denmark. Among the missionaries was an elder who was going to Utah and wanted me to go with him. I had no money, so he asked all the saints to help with their surplus means to help me go to Utah. At 11:30 a.m. next day, enough money had been raised to buy my ticket to New York. That day, I had 13 missionaries to feed and to get ready to be on the steamer by 4 o'clock. I got it all done and got ready and left with the other saints, April the 12th, 1863, under Anders Christensen, the leader of that part of the immigration, for Hamburg. We left there for Grimsby, England. After staying a few days, we left for Liverpool, England, by rail. My lover, James Thurston, and I joined the saints and immigrated together as far as Liverpool, England. I'll say here, I had more than one offer of marriage, but refused them to stay true to the one of my choice. Because of this fact, I was separated from my lover and put on another ship with strangers to go to New York. I left Liverpool Friday, May 8th, 1863, on the ship B.S. Kimball with 650 saints under the direction of Hans Peter Lund. My lover, James, left the same day with 38 saints under the direction of Anders Christensen on the ship Consignment. My ship, the ship B.S. Kimball, landed in New York June 15th. The Consignment landed at New York June 20th, 5 days later, 1863. When I landed at New York, I had no clothes, only what I stood up in, and no money. My baggage went with the other company's baggage, and I could go no further. I was placed in a hard position in a strange land among strangers and could not speak the language. At 6 o'clock that evening, the company was to leave for Florence, Nebraska by rail. I asked the captain, H.P. Lund, for help to go with the saints, and he answered, I did not belong to that company, so he could do nothing for me. The company went on, and I was left alone in Garden Castle, not knowing where to go or to lay my head that night. 18 years. No clothes, no money, alone, no friends. Can you imagine? Well, continuing her story. While standing there, an apostate came up and asked me to go home with him and keep his house for his wife until the other ship came in. I accepted. Therefore, every day after my work was done, I would walk down to Castle Garden to see if the rest of the company had arrived. 5 days passed before they arrived. When they came, the first one I met was my lover. I need not say how happy we were when we met. I lived in hopes that he could help me to Florence, as I knew he had money. But unfortunately for me, he had given all he had to a poor man and his family just a half hour before. So I asked the president for help, and he had no help for me. I was left once more to go back to that place where I had stayed until I could go further. I stayed there 2 weeks longer, and will say it was the hardest time I'd ever spent in my whole life. My virtue was sought in every way by that rascal, but the Lord kept me from temptation and harm. Here's Regetta, 18 years old, no money, no friends, a few clothes in her trunk that was probably with the other company now, but Still nothing. And how to get 1,200 miles from Castle Garden, New York to Florence, Nebraska, or to Omaha, Nebraska, where the train stopped. How could she get money to pay for a train ticket? Her story tells us how. There was a Dutch immigrant that had concluded to stay in New York with his daughter who was living there. So I got his ticket and came to Omaha with the man and his wife I was working for and stayed with them until I could get away. As a last resort to accomplish his vile purpose, he got his wife to go see some of her friends. She finally consented to go. When we were alone, he wanted to buy some wine. I did not know what to say, so I thought a minute and said, yes. As he went out the front door hall to buy some wine, I went out the back way into the pouring rain and ran as hard as I could. I finally came to a blacksmith shop where I inquired my way and how far it was to Florence. They told me to keep right on the way I was going for a few miles, and I would get there all right. I went a short distance when I caught up with two men in covered wagons and ox teams. They offered me a ride and asked me where I was going. I told them in my broken language my circumstances and where I wanted to go. They told me they were there to meet the immigrants and help them get to Utah. I got up into the wagon, but had not gone far when I looked out and saw a man coming on foot as hard as he could run, calling to the brethren to stop. I knew him and asked the brethren to help me and not let him take me back again. They assured me they would, and for me not to be afraid. I had quite a time with the man, but succeeded in keeping me out of his clutches, and I came on to safety. I reached Florence and went to Elder William Clough of Provo, who I knew would see to my welfare. He was at the church store. He sent me to live with a family named Thompson, his acquaintances, until the church teams were to leave. After staying there 2 days, I was walking along the street when a man spoke to me, as he could see I was an immigrant, and asked me to go with him and his wife across the plains to take care of her, as she was in delicate condition, and told me to speak to Elder Clough about it, which I did. Elder Clough said it would be all right, so he gave me a feather bed, a bolster, and a pair of blankets. I went with Brother and Sister Cedarstrom, leaving Florence July 25th, 1863, for our long journey to Utah. For a while, I even drove the wagon for the Cedarstroms. My other duties were to gather buffalo chips for the fire and to fill the water. The only communication we had of other companies that were ahead of us was on buffalo skulls, on which they had written and left by the roadside. We read on one of a stampede of the cattle dated July 28, 1863, where 9 were killed and 13 wounded. A few days later, we came across a woman and 4 or 5 children whose husband had been wounded in the stampede and was unable to go on. He had died, and she had buried him alone by the roadside and was waiting for the next company to come along. She was a Danish lady and told me that there were in the company people that I knew. I described my lover and asked if he was there. She told me one young man got killed that answered to my lover's description. From then, I was almost beside myself with grief, believing him dead. I had my duties to attend to. So next day, as I had been gathering fuel, I had my lap full of chips. and went up to the back of the wagon to put them in, and I fell unconscious on the ground. The wagons drove on and left me there. How long I lay there, I do not know. Or I knew nothing for 3 days. When I became conscious again, I found myself in another man's wagon. He was Brother Elias Edwards from Goshen, Utah. I was so weak I stayed in his wagon for a few days. He did all he could for me and gave me the best he had to eat and nursed me back to health again. From that time on, he paid me marked attention and helped me every way he could. When I was able to walk again, I went back to Cedarstrom's wagon and stayed with them until we reached Salt Lake City. During our journey, my clothes were all in rags. My feet were blistered to the ankles. My hair had fallen out from the effects of my sickness, the stress, and walking all the way bareheaded in sun. I took my bolster and emptied the feathers out and made me a sack dress out of the ticking. This was what remained of my dress, constituted my wearing apparel or costume. We were now nearing Salt Lake City, and I was feeling bad because I looked so bad. I prayed to the Lord to open the way for me to get something to wear. I knew not how it would come, but I trusted in the Lord and had full confidence in him and knew it would be given me. When we arrived at Fort Richer, where Johnston's army had been some time previous, I went out by myself at noon in the sagebrush where no one could see me. I stopped, and right in front of me lay a $5 greenback. I picked it up. It was folded together 8 times. I know the Lord led me to that place in answer to my prayer. With it, I bought me a dress and a pair of slippers of a girl my size that fit me very nicely. I was now prepared to enter Salt Lake City. I cannot describe my gratitude and thanks at that time to my Heavenly Father for his kindness to me. On the evening before reaching Salt Lake City, Brother Elias Edwards asked me to be his wife. Thinking my lover dead, I consented the next evening, as I wanted a little time to think about it. My second choice, Brother Edwards, then wanted me to go with him to his home in Goshen, Utah. I told him all my circumstances, that my heart was still with my first love and as yet no one else. But as he had been so kind to me and I had promised him to be his wife, I would go home with him on those conditions. We were married September 28, 1863. Our home was an adobe room, 12 feet by 14 feet, with dirt roof, lumber floor, and a fireplace, 1 door, and a small window with no window panes. My husband made a bedstead table, bench, and 2 stools. He brought from the States a step stove, 6 plates, 6 cups and saucers, and 2 flat irons. My dishes and flat irons were the luxuries of the town. My husband was a good, kind husband, but shortly after our marriage, he took sick with quick consumption, which is known as tuberculosis now. So we moved to Salt Lake City where he could get medical aid. We took our step stove with us and sold it for $150 to get money to buy medicine and pay doctor bills. We left our stock and furniture expecting to return and get them. A few days after our arrival in Salt Lake City, while walking along the street, I met Sister Hendrickson, a lady that crossed the ocean when I did. We were very glad to meet each other. In our conversation, she told me my lover was alive and staying with them. I could hardly believe her at first. She insisted on bringing him to Salt Lake City to see me. And the next Sunday, My husband asked me if I was going to leave him and marry my first lover. I answered him, no, I had promised to stay with him until death parted us, and I was going to do so. We were very poor now, and I had to make the living and care for my sick husband. I rented a room from a Swedish lady, and she took care of my husband of daytimes while I would go out to wash for whoever could afford to hire me for a day. Among those I worked for was Phineas Young, Brigham Young's brother, who was very kind to me and always filled my apron with some kind of garden stuff and other things to take home. I got a little sewing to do, which I did of evening. In this way, I managed to get along. We were wondering how our stock were that we had left in Goshen, so I started one morning bright and early and walked to the Lehigh Bridge by evening. I walked all night and reached our home next morning very tired, the distance being 65 miles. After spending the day there and finding our stock had been driven off, I took what little flour and other things I could carry and started back to Salt Lake City that evening, covering the distance in the same amount of time. I made that same long journey twice that summer. My husband died August the 9th or 11th, 1864, and Phineas Young showed his kindness to me and took charge of everything and never charged me 1 cent for it. He was buried in Salt Lake City. After his death, I went out to work every day. Before his death, he always said it would be right for me to marry my first lover after his death. Maybe you're wondering how Regetta and James missed each other in Florence on the way to Salt Lake City on the trail, since they should have been relatively close to each other. She says, when James arrived in Florence, he was hired as a teamster and went up the river to work for Godby to drive freight teams across the plains. That is how we became separated again, and he escaped being in the company where so many had been killed, as that was the company he was to travel with. He arrived in Salt Lake City on October of 1863 and went to work at West Jordan for a man named Camp until the next spring, when we met again. Well, on September 2nd of 1864, I was married to James Thurston, and we had 15 children together. If you want to learn more about that family and their married life and its joys and trials, that is another story.